to be able to introduce Dr. Jacob Nordangård, who is a remarkable Swedish man who describes himself as a geographer, a political geographer as well, and a researcher, and also a musician. But he has done a remarkable amount of work looking at the connections between national and international groups. And we last spoke about some of the areas of his research that he turned up, but he's uncovered a lot of new things that I have learned a lot about since then. It's a great thrill to welcome you back, Jacob, and thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
I just thought as I was going to start the interview that it would be I'm fascinated in your PhD journey. I've supervised many PhD students.
Yeah.
It's a challenging journey, I know, and I suppose particularly challenging for you because you were uncovering a lot of information that didn't actually meet the agreed narrative that was around at the time. And so can you just tell me a little bit about that? Because I think it's fascinating in terms of the overview of universities and how they have lost some of their quest for knowledge, because now there's only certain narratives that are acceptable in universities. But at your time, and I think your thesis came out in 2012, so you must have been doing research for the 3 or 4 years before that. How was that period of time, and how was it when you really uncovered the story that was completely different to how you understood it when you first began your research quest?
This actually started when I was a student in geography, just before attending this PhD program. And at first I was a member of the Green Party, and I believed in the climate narrative and everything, and all the stories about the environment. So that was the context, and I came into this university, and I wanted to know more about energy, peak oil theory. That's what got me into this. And so at first it was easy because I said the right things, and I didn't question climate narrative, of course. So it was a gradual thing. What I know about the peak oil theory, it was M.K. Hubbard, an American oil geologist, and he was the one that popularized this concept. But I know it has been talked about since the late 19th century. And I know also about, I think what's it called? Fletcher something. He was into the oil and politics in the United States. And he said that it was decided during a scientific meeting in the late 19th century, that the origin of oil wasn't biotic. It was instead fossil. And that was what made this possible, to talk about the depletion of the oil reservoirs of the world and so on, because it was not a natural process. But that's the beginning of it. And then, so we started then, and behind this scientific agreement, we find the usual suspects, Standard Oil, that wanted to have high oil prices and said that it will run out. It's just so we can't sell it that cheap and so on. So they have been doing this for a long time. But then in the 50s, M.K. Hubbard and he was an economist at I think it was Shell Oil in the United States. And he put up these scenarios. And he also was actually one of the founders of the technocracy movement and it's interesting because this so I learned about technocracy movement because I was interested about peak oil theory. And eventually I also found out that he was a member of the Club of Rome, and he proposed this new economic system because of this thing with running out of oil. That connected it also to the climate. Yeah.
And so, Jacob, when in your studies, so peak oil was the sort of theory you came in, you're a member of the Green Party, but when did it dawn on you as you uncovered some of the information that everything wasn't as it seemed?
Yes. One thing that I found, they talked about climate a lot in media, but they didn't mention anything about depletion of oil. And that was the first thing that made me suspicious. And I thought, why? So I first thought that they pushed for the climate agenda to hide this thing with, okay, we have a very serious thing with oil running out. So we can have the same measures with climate policy as we have with the other. So that was the first thing I thought. This was wrong. I found out later, but it got suspicion and wanted to know more about it. And then I started to do a study about, it was biofuels. That was because and this was part of my studies in geography. So I wanted to know how much biofuels we could produce in Sweden, because at the time, our prime minister had said that biofuels will solve the issue of climate and also running out of oil. So I asked, okay, is this possible? And I started to look into this. And of course, it wasn't possible, because in order to produce that amount of biofuels that you needed, you have to have a society run on oil. If you had a renewable energy systems to create renewable energy, it wouldn't work at all. And as I did that, I wanted to have a background analysis on the climate science. And then when I did this, I wanted to have both perspectives. What is the official perspective, the narrative that the media works on and tells us, but do we have opposing opinion about this? A scientific debate. So I started to dig into this and really dig into this. And then that was the moment when this isn't science. The climate science is not based on sound science. It's just climate modeling about the future. They had no real proof behind these claims. And that kind of shocked me, because everyone had told me that it was this way, that the IPCC they're telling the truth about climate, and we have to do these things, and all the politicians and so on, and also university professors that I had met talked about it, but it was no science behind. So I was horrified. I mean, I'm at the university and no one is questioning this. But I found people.
What were your supervisors saying at that stage then? So did the supervisors start to become alarmed that you were not meeting the sort of norms that were expected in terms of propping up what was generally accepted as the main idea here?
At this time, I wrote this in 2006. And at that time, you could still have some criticism. And I had at the time also a supervisor that was supporting me. He was in geography and he was more a critical thinker. So he was very interested in what I was digging into and support at the time. I was from the Green Party, I had my views, and I presented a paper that was, I would say, very balanced. So I didn't say this is right or this is wrong. I said, this is the views on this side and this is the views on this side. But I also said, it's impossible to create this biofuel society. That was a conclusion. But you couldn't read this paper and say, that I was climate skeptic, because I just told the different sides in this. So this paper actually won a competition. I presented the thing about climate, but it won a competition from the Green Party's think tank in Sweden, and also some other environmental organizations. I think I was in second place in this competition. So I actually went to a meeting with this think tank and I presented these views. But at that time, I became a climate skeptic, because I sent this a couple of professors working with climate science in Sweden. So they read it and I thought it was good as well. So I actually had support from both sides, because it was also like I criticized the society that we had at the same time. So I had a critical perspective that the Greens liked, but also problematized it. And they mentioned this when they gave me the prize as well. This is an author that isn't afraid of discussing these things.
I suppose, as well as that time, things hadn't quite solidified into a one view only in relation to the climate. So there was still some preparedness to at least think about some other options.
Yes. Yeah, and the thing in the Green Party at that time, I was in my community. I was at the city planning board for the Green Party at the time, because I was interested in city planning questions about the issues. And my colleagues in the Green Party, they didn't discuss climate change. It wasn't an issue for them at the time. It was other, and some of them had been around since the 70s. It was a totally different kind of environmental issues. So climate hadn't taken over everything at that time. But then it got fast. It just changed like overnight. And so I had this paper, this thesis, student thesis. And with this, I could apply for this PhD student program. And my new supervisor, he thought this was great. And I remember I presented myself at the board meeting they had at the Climate Policy Center. And I remember he said, yeah, and Jacob, he is also a member of the Green Party. And everyone, yeah. So it was political, you could say. But then I more and more start to question this. First, because of you can't mix the peak oil theory with the climate change narrative. It's either you have too much oil or no oil. And it's just, how can you just say these two things at the same time? But people did. So for me, it was, we will run out of oil. That was what I thought at the time. So it will not be possible to have these scenarios anyway. And so I wrote this in my master thesis that I wrote. And then I started this PhD student program. And at that time, I wrote then about biofuels also, but it was the European Union biofuels policy that I investigated and decided to do an actor network study to study connections and study lobbyism at this high political level. And as I did this, I also wanted to know what kind of groups have pushed the climate agenda. How did this get to be an issue? Because at that time I knew this was this kind of, it's not like it's science in that sense, but it's classic science. This is projections of the future. It's very futuristic. So how did this come? But now everyone says that this is the truth. So I started to make an investigation. I was supposed to write 5 pages, but it ended up in 50 pages, because what I found was that the big foundations built on the wealth of oil and the automobile industry and so on was supporting this from the very beginning. So it shocked me. I made a working paper that I published. I went to my supervisor, gave him this and said, wow, do you know about these things? But he just said, I don't think it's even worth to discuss this paper at our seminar. Why do you even bother to do this? I think you should write about biofuels. It was biofuels you should write about, not the background to the climate issue. But for me, it was very important. It was just a background chapter. So he didn't, it was like, and I thought this is very important. And I said it also to my, I had another supervisor. I didn't even read it. Not interested, because he had built a career on as the climate professor. He was an associate professor at the time, but when he made this career because of the climate and became a professor, he had no experience at all in climate science. Of course, it was more political science, and I think he had a graduate in literature, something like that. So it was an example on the people that goes into this, and they get a lot of money. He got a lot of funding to build up this center for climate policy that I became a part of. And then it was very obvious that it was not a policy center that were critically discussing these issues. It was like, we know that the climate change is happening, it's humans that is responsible, and it's bad, and we are going to study the process and actively come up with suggestions on how we can better the political organizations to handle this and so on. And we studied the negotiations, but it was no study of the background, because nobody at this institute actually knew anything about the background. And because I asked them, do you know how we started with climate? No idea. I mean, they said like, I remember 80s. Maybe the background, the IPCC in 1988, it was founded and so on, but they didn't know how this had been pushed through and what kind of groups were behind it. No idea. And it was not welcome to even discuss this. So that's when it became more difficult for me.
No, I can understand. It's very interesting for universities, places of inquiry, but it's interesting, isn't it, that my experience over the many years is that inquiry is okay only if it upholds the current thoughts. And it's very hard to get a new idea, particularly when the whole concept of what's happening with the climate is built on and built careers for people and built funding. And that's where we are really continuing in this whole story, that the modelers have got extraordinary amounts of funds over the last probably 35 years. And it's very hard to go back to the beginning. So in terms of your thesis, then, you called it a Latin title meaning order out of chaos. I noted just in passing that it's also the motto of the 33rd level of the Freemasons. And just tell me about, is there any linkage in this story to the Freemasons? And did you ever uncover any work of the Freemasons in your thesis?
I didn't do it in the thesis, but the thing is, I found that we also have a kind of an occult agenda that is working behind the scenes. So when I had written the thesis, that I just have to study real political sources and documents, but I found a lot of references to this occult thought. It was everywhere, and especially in organizations that were working more like lobby organizations. And like, for example, the Aspen Institute in Colorado, USA, they had these books published in the 70s, but they had this very clear, it was very clear that those who wrote it was Freemasons, because they had this kind of language, and so you recognize it. If you have studied these topics, recognize it directly.
Interesting, Jacob, that you've written just in the last 24 hours about Eurovision, but your post was very important. It's a travesty, really, what happened. And it's exposed the underbelly of what Eurovision is about and what's behind many of those things. So I think it is interesting that the occult is tied up with a lot of things that we just didn't understand. So that's fascinating that you uncovered some of those things as well. But through the work of your research, I suppose that's where you kept on coming back to the founding issues around the Rocker family and their significance, really from the time of the foundation of Standard Oil through to our current day. So was that a theme that you stumbled upon, or just as you investigated the trails, it all led back to the Rockefellers?
Yeah, very much. It was like whenever I started to investigate, go backwards, it was like you follow a paper trail. And you start with a political document, a resolution or whatever. And in that resolution, they have a footnote that says this is based on whatever. And you can follow all the trails back. And a lot of the times, this political idea started at the Bellagio Center in Italy. And that's the Rockefeller Foundations. That's where we have important meetings to come up with consensus around new emerging issues. So it was a lot of times. Just why? It's just they are very involved. And I also found a lot of organizations that I was studying. If I was going back in history, the founding of these organizations, it was like we found Rockefeller Foundation and Ford Foundation, Carnegie. It was kind of this troika, but almost everywhere. So they have been creating organizations and also at the UN level, been involved in funneling in money to it so that it has started to grow. And then the member states have stepped in for the funding. So they were so it was like creating the foundation for this. And so that was very revealing for me and very interesting to see. And I just had to go into it more and just, okay, why do we have this situation? And what was the purpose? What is the thinking about it? What's in it for them? So that's when I started really to get interesting in especially in the Rockefeller family.
No, it's fascinating. I did so enjoy your book, and just for viewers, the book is now out in English, and I like the French title better, Masters of the Game. I think it was the Maître du Jeu, but I think what the English title is, it Controlling the Game, or?
Yes, it's Controlling the Game.
Yes.
And I mean, and the reason I have that title is because I wrote the song Rockefeller,
yes,
Controlling the Game.
Yes.
I sing those lines, and the Rockefeller song was a part of the soundtrack to the book. So that's why the title is that.
That's great. I've just so enjoyed. We'll move on to your music next for just to how it fits in, because I've so enjoyed Wardenclyffe and this remarkable genre of doom rock, of which I knew nothing until I listened to some of the things that you'd done. But it's a fascinating genre in itself. And I'm just I've just got a clip here of Wardenclyffe. I'll just see if I can share the screen here. Can you see that now, Jacob?
No, yeah, here it's
so look, it's great to be able to share this. I've loved this song. I've played it so many times. And just tell us a little bit about how you even came up with the idea as a musician of integrating in some way what you were writing about and then what you were composing in this particular situation. And then we'll listen to a little bit of Rockefeller.
Yeah, if you're going into the background, I had a soundtrack to the doctoral thesis, Ordo ab Chao. And the background was that I had started my own band during my studies, because it was like I needed this. It was a situation at the university. It was not easy. And I actually changed. My supervisor before were not supporting me, so I changed this to the supervisor I had during my geography studies, and he supported me at the end of this work. But he was the only one I could discuss this with, and I built up a lot of feelings inside that it was hard to express in. You can't write it in a doctoral thesis. So I used music to when I got angry and so on, and just let out the steam, and it was very refreshing for me. And I used the themes from my research and made songs of. So it just evolved and came natural. And it's because of this with my research. I hadn't done this. I have been in doing records before. I have other bands, but it was like when I got a daughter, and I didn't have really that time with it. But when this research came in, it was like I just had to. I just had to do it. So now my band concept, it's built around my research, and also the name of a group, Wardenclyffe. It also have its connections to my research, and for because Wardenclyffe, that's the name of the tower that Nikola Tesla built in New York for energy transmission. So I wrote about energy. So it was the right thing to have. And I also found references a lot to Nikola Tesla when I was doing research about these strange groups that were trying to influence things in the background. Yeah, it was a great way to combine this, and also. And that has been very fun, because I also working with other musicians, and I also worked with, you can see some pictures in the video that has been done by an artist that I came in contact with, Kimmy Fransson. So I worked with him. He has made a cover for the Swedish edition of the Rockefeller book and so on.
It's a great track. And
yeah,
it's wonderful to see the images that come with the track as well. Is really wonderful. And you've fitted a lot of material in here. You've got Kissinger and many of the other images, and it's a great way that you've put everything together, Jacob.
Yeah, and it was fun to do this. But also, it's my book in 5 minutes. I tried to get in as much material as possible to explain the story.
You've done a great job, and it somehow brings it in a very real way to the whole viewer as well. So I've enjoyed playing that, and I've enjoyed a lot of the other music that you've made. So it's unique. I don't think I know anyone else that have melded some ideas and put music behind it. And in your particular case, you've used this story in heavy metal and doom rock to push forward the ideas, which are much harder to assimilate when you're going to read them all. But when you see it right before you and you hear the song, it's very easy. So I think it's wonderful what you've done, and I love the work of Wardenclyffe. So thank you for that great work.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. It's not everyone that can grasp this. That I do both of do music and research. So
no, I've loved
it's appreciated.
And yeah. just going on to the next area that I was wanting to talk to you about, as I've been reading your recent works, and even some of the older works, I've realized that Sweden has a much more significant role than many other small countries would be expected to have in this whole climate change story. And I suppose it does go back to the 19th century as well. But could you just sketch out the story of Sweden itself and its important role in the bigger picture of this climate change narrative? And of course, we have Greta, who became an icon and was used very effectively. But are there some specific situations in relation to Sweden, why Sweden became so prominent, Jacob?
Yes, it is. And we can start with Svante Arrhenius. he was behind the theory of human influence on the climate through the burning of fossil fuels. So he's an icon, and he also is always mentioned. And actually, I was at the Stockholm University, and that's where he was raised and educated. But his ideas wasn't really, it wasn't because of that theory he got the Nobel Prize, but he became a very influential figure in Sweden. And he was also a board member of the Institute of Racial Hygiene and stuff. So this connects this to eugenics.
No, it's one of the bizarre things, Jacob, in this whole story is that as you trace the story through, with all the groups, eugenics has a key role all the way through these different groups, doesn't it?
Yes, yeah, and especially founding of it, and still is very much. That's what we talk about. But if we continue with this story, Arrhenius, he had a student. His name was Carl Gustav Rossby. And he was a meteorologist, one of the most famous Swedish, and he had some education also in Norway. I think Norway was big in these issues at that time. And I think he's called Bjerknes or something in Norway. But Rossby, he was approved by Arrhenius and so on, with connections. And he was sent with a scholarship to United States. And he came to Woods Hole Institute. I think it's Massachusetts. And that institute was founded by Rockefeller Foundation. So he was picked up very early. This is in the 30s. And he became a rising star in meteorology in the United States. He was one of the most prominent in this area and built up. He was in the US Weather Bureau, and he built up the Department of Meteorology at the University of Chicago, that also was a Rockefeller Institute. Eventually became also, he was a Swedish-American citizen, so he had a double citizenship. And during the Second World War, he was involved with the military, because the military needed meteorologists. So he was part of a board that discussed these issues. And after the Second World War, he came back to Sweden and built up an institution at the Stockholm University, the Meteorological Institute. And when you read about the background to this institute, it's mentioned that American military personnel was trained at that place as well. So they had these connections between the Rockefeller network, American military, because when we come to carbon dioxide theory in the 50s, it starts very much with military funding. That was from a lot of money after the Second World War, during the Second. And so Stockholm is made like a hub in this network. It's the Swedish division, and it's run by a scientist that has been trained in the United States and as a Rockefeller funded. And Bert Bolin, Bert Bolin is the next guy I will talk about, because he also had a student, PhD student, that also was, he was in, I think he was in Chicago. He was at the Institute of Advanced Study, and that was Bert Bolin. And Bert Bolin, he came to be the first chairman of the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change in the 80s. So it's very early on, and we can follow news student Rossby student Bert Bolin.
But it traces back to the Rockefellers in terms of funding and study and
eugenics. Yeah. And if we look into the 50s, when this is discussed and made an important topic. It begins a lot with the Population Council founding in 1952, and that's a Rockefeller Institute. And at that meeting, we found a lot of eugenicists, of course, discussing how can we lower population on Earth. But one of those members were also a friend to Carl Gustav Rossby, another professor, but an American professor called Roger Revelle. And he is seen as the modern founding father of the global warming theory. But Rossby and Revelle they were very close, cooperating with each other. These Swedish and American teams, but they got funding to build up measurements of carbon dioxide, and everything was. And this theory then had this scientific breakthrough at a big meeting, something called the International Geophysical Year, that was between, I think it was 57, 58. So they worked for this to create this field, and it was successful, and they got more funding, and they started to get funds from the government and so on to do this. And then you just can follow that the first kind of conference we really have on carbon dioxide that is international in scope. You find scientists from Stockholm University and Roger Revelle's institution. And I think it's one other scientist that was at the Ford Motor Company at the time. So it's a very tiny group with American, Swedish scientists. They are those who start this. And then it just explodes after a couple of years. But I mention it in my book as and like the American-Swedish project or military project.
Now I can see the military is much more important than I realized, and that the linkage between Arrhenius and then the students going to study in America and the University of Chicago and the Rockefeller family and the Rockefeller University. It's University of Chicago, very interesting because it all makes sense that there needs to be a central location in Europe, and then this is being set up as well. And what I did do is to try to put some of the work that you've done into a flowchart. So I'm just going to try and share that with you to see if this makes sense to you. And what I did was what I was trying to do with this chart was to really ask the question, how did we get to a global new world order? And following your work through, it starts with John D. Rockefeller in the 1870s after Standard Oil. And I think you pointed out that Rockefeller influence of money has come right down to today from the five sons of, I think, John D. the third, but it comes right down to today and influences politics, banking, religion, art, climate, many other areas as well. So there's nothing that the Rockefellers didn't touch. And when I've traced the flow from what you're describing, you might just like to talk a little bit about this chart, because what seemed to happen is that Standard Oil ran into monopoly problems. And so therefore there was a problem because John D. the first was the wealthiest man in the world and had a bad image. And one of the things was to reinvent himself as a philanthropist.
Yes.
And I was fascinated that actually on this chart, 1913 was a pretty important year, because that year was also the year when federal income tax started in the US, and many of the significant foundations were created so that the wealthy didn't have to pay tax. So
yes.
It's interesting that the philanthropists have come along, and there was the Carnegie Foundation, or the Carnegie Foundation as well, for international peace, who were actually promoting war.
Exactly.
Can you say just a little bit about that? And you might just like to talk through this chart from that philanthropy story through the next phases of the chart that I've got up.
Yes, shall I discuss all of how they have doing it or what?
Yes. So I suppose it's just an interesting thing to me because that's a step-by-step tool for gaining control of the whole
Control.
world.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah. Yeah.
so it's
Yeah, it is, and that's it's very smart to be able to fund your pet projects. And it's we ordinary people, we pay our taxes and someone else decide what the tax is going to be used for. But these people, it's okay, we have also pay our kind of tax, but it's to our projects, but we can influence the world with this, and at the same time be like a good philanthropist.
yes, a very
We are
good
great people, we are
publicity.
good people, we are doing good for everyone. And it's just, yeah, it's amazing how they rebranded themselves.
And it
And
seemed to be
it's,
that identification of so-called global problems. So they were funding education and health. And as you point out in one of your other talks, that these guys were very significant. They could see the League of Nations, which was the progenitor of the United Nations, was a very useful tool for them. And so a range of other different organizations were created as well, really to promote the Rockefellers' values of global dominance.
yes, yeah, very much. And they are doing this. What we don't see in this chart is kind of the alliances that they have, because they don't work alone. That's how they have managed to do this, because they have um, other influential players that are working with them. We have been in an alliance with the Rothschild child network since the 1890s, for example. First they had a competition about the oil industry and so on, but it was like, no, we can't beat them, and we have to fuse our agendas together to create this. And also with the Carnegie, I mean, that's very important in the early 20th century, with how Andrew Carnegie, the Gospel of Wealth, and so on. It's and then we have the Ford Foundation in 1936, I think. But it was just a few influential players at that time that actually has managed to create the world that we are in at the time. And of course, it was this globalization and internationalization. It's very much their fingerprints in it from the beginning. And also that they have been successful is that they have supported groups with similar ideals. Not necessary that they agree with everything they do, but they have been able to use these groups for their own benefit, special ideas about internationalization and so on.
And I think the thing that I realized as I heard another one of your talks was the realization by these very wealthy guys that you couldn't trust democracy would end up giving you the wrong results. You had to start controlling a lot of the politics and organizations and so forth. And so they saw the United Nations then after the war as being a vehicle for great influence. And then the Rockefeller Brothers Private Fund was started. And that led down to the story of global problems being identified. And it seemed to me that from that period on the chart here, I haven't got all the organizations involved, but
Yeah.
from the 50s to the 90s, there was the Population Council, the World Wildlife Fund, the Conservation Foundation, the Club of Rome, the Council of Foreign Relations, and then individuals like Henry Kissinger, who were very significant, and his disciple, Klaus Schwab, who then formed what became the World Economic Forum. And that led us through to the Earth Summit in Rio. And then out of that, really, the whole story of Agenda 21. And it's interesting, Jacob, I found some papers here in Australia that came out of that Agenda 21 story that were sent to all the local councils, which are quite small bodies in Australia, with instructions of how to meet all the targets in this Agenda 21. So there was nothing democratic about it. It was just
No, no,
sent
no.
down and people were told to do it. And so the needs then, of course, to be an increasing global crisis. And I think I worked out that the COP conferences, which have been annual, now up to their 29th one, I think, this year. And I think you mentioned Paris as being a very significant one, but those COP conferences are getting increasingly important in determining policies and agenda setting, aren't they?
Yes, they are very important in furthering this agenda. And people don't know what's happening at this meeting. And the Paris Agreement is a very big part of this. It's the greening agenda, it's the net zero emissions agenda. And that's where they have the big negotiations between member countries to achieve this. And at the same time, it's when you know that those who discuss this is it was the Rockefeller family very important and the Trilateral Commission setting up this thing. And the last time they had a meeting, it was in Dubai, a COP meeting in Dubai discussing climate in a country that is built on oil. It's everything for them. They had no wealth at all without it. It's just so it gets very obvious when you look into what are they trying to achieve with this, what are they doing. They are pushing solutions for the climate problem that these actors can make money on. Yeah.
Is the end game, do you think, is it basically global control with what the UN's trying to do with the Summit of the Future, or the World Health Organization is doing with their new regulations? Is that the end goal, or is there another aim here? Because somewhere there's got to be profit involved, I imagine.
Yes, always profit, but it's not one agenda, it's a couple of agendas, because in everything they have a grand plan that are leading to this new society that they sketched up and that they want to achieve. But in every move they make, all the crisis that is coming, that is about making profit on it. So crisis makes opportunity. That's a motto we're using. But it's of course, the end goal is this very tightly controlled society. And with one big aspect of the Summit of the Future is a crisis management. That's what they want to achieve with this thing with the emergency platform. And a crisis management is very profitable. And when they also have this built up, these power structures and the partnerships they have between United Nations and the WEF, and all these corporations operating with it, and all these corporations, they have already been in groups, shaping the future groups in a lot of areas, every aspect that you can think of, and are more or less prepared for the kind of crisis that will come. And I know this from studying European Union politics, that they have think tanks that are set up to, you have this big corporation comes in with, we want to achieve this, we want to make profit on this, how can you help us? So it's okay. So they try to influence the game, influence politics and activists and everyone, so they get the legislation in the end that makes profit for this corporation. And that's the idea behind this. And I wrote a lot about this in my doctoral thesis. A lot of the management ideas from McKinsey has been, yeah.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because as you say, the key tool really is crisis. And Klaus himself talked about that in that famous speech he gave in 2020 and the fourth industrial revolution. So there needs to be manufactured crises to create the sort of order that is needed by these people who see a global solution. And your view, I think, is that these people may have good intentions to try and govern the world in a more just way. There may be something like this behind it, but ultimately they want all the power. So it seems as though those crises are going to keep on coming. Jacob. And your recent writing really for me has been illuminating, because just when you think you've uncovered the number of organizations, that there are even more. So the Stimson Institute and the Global Challenges Foundation and the Future of Humanity Institute and the Climate Governance Commission, and it goes on, doesn't it? So
yeah, it does.
It's almost impossible. And I realized this is an impossible thing to overcome. There are too many organizations and too much money pushing us in this direction. So it looks as though we have no hope to beat these globalists. Do you think we have any chance?
Yes, I do, because I think the things that is evolving now gets so stupid, and I see it as we have natural laws that is governing us, and you can't beat that. They try to copy natural processes and so on, and they have mapped us. They have done everything, study about humans and our reactions, psychology, everything. They have everything, but it won't work. And it's my work was as one part of this, just to map all how they are doing this. It's a big illusion. And when you have the tricks of illusionists, it doesn't work. So that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to expose this, trying to explain how they are manipulating and doing this, because it's techniques. So more and more people are actually getting aware of this. And it's a big difference between now and it was like 20 years ago when I started doing research. Because a lot of this global power play that it has been increased. It's more and more of that. But at first, we didn't know actually how this worked. So we had no idea. A crisis hit and people just scared. But now we are seeing this is a part of something. They're doing the same kind of things every time. It's not much that fantasy or creativity. It's just very business orientated, business like thinking. And I think, and they get hubris as well with, okay, we got away with it. Now we can, let's rob another bank. I think it's like when we have a small criminal thinking, I get away with it. This is the same with these people. They get away with it, and now I want more. I just don't want $1 trillion this time. I was even more, because I want to have this feeling, this thrill of what I'm doing, and it always ends in disaster. I think that will happen.
Tell me this. So just to conclude, we've got the Summit of the Future coming up in September, and they've gone to a lot of trouble, and the papers have been presented, and I've read them all, and it's almost impossible to understand. I wrote down this great aim. It says the Summit of the Future aims for inclusive, networked, and effective multilateralism.
Yeah.
Earth does it even mean? So, but what should we be looking out for? What are the crises that you think might be being manufactured that are coming forward that we need to keep an eye out for? Because it's clear crises are used very effectively to control the whole world.
I think what they need to push this further is not one crisis. They talk about polycrisis, like 1, 2, 3 crises at the same time. When we have the situation in Israel, with Gaza, war in Ukraine, that's one crisis, and that can be expanded with war theaters and so on. And then we can have like a biological agent, or some we even discuss this. I have mad people involved with this. We could have an atomic winter for a couple of years. It would be good for the planet. How can we even think about that? But I think we could have a couple of scenarios, a couple of the crises, all that they have been discussing in the the Great Transition report that I have been written about in my books, and also the scenarios from the Rockefeller Foundation in 2010. They had a couple of different things that they discussed. But we also have this with Klaus Schwab said this, and it's also in the emergency platform policy brief about this black swan event. Can only speculate what it could be, but Klaus Schwab said it will be a black swan event, more or less.
Yes, I think we can trust Klaus to deliver that. And
yeah,
there's also the notorious disease X.
Yeah,
These guys,
they are preparing for something. They want the infrastructure ready, and when they have it, they will try a new scenario because they want to test their new system. If we have this emergency platform, if they have this new pandemic accord, of course, how do this work? So that's very possible with a new kind of pandemic.
Yes. Now you can see it's a very useful tool, and it's been used very effectively, and most effectively with the coronavirus pandemic, because I don't think anyone expected that it would be quite as successful as it was in shutting down everything and gaining control of everyone. And that's led to the ongoing story with now digital IDs coming through, and that's well on the way here in Australia. And of course, now control of information as well with so-called misinformation. So it's becoming harder. Just finally, any great tips for beating these bad actors that are working out how to try and take control of us, Jacob?
Humor. We have to, that is an important tool to use against these people that are humorless, just to point out how stupid this is and laugh about it. Satire, as that kind of thing. I think that's something that, and it binds together people. We can discuss it and laugh about it. And I think that is more efficient than coming out like saying, oh, those evil people in the top and so on. It's more, no, they don't actually have that kind of power. They just have, we have given them that power, and now we can take it from them, and we can laugh at them. And it's because it's just so foolish things. And as I pointed out in some of my Substack articles as well, these people are, it's like total madness. Future of Humanity Institute. Upload our minds to the internet and stuff. It's
no, you wonder how these guys can even bring this up as a serious story, but they're very serious. And I think you're right. Humor is a great way of dealing with it. And where is your work taking you? What's the next step for you?
That's the thing. What I planned is my next book I've been working on for a while. It's called The Temple of Solomon. And in that book, I look into the more occult part of agenda, the New Age movement and so on, and how it fits into this thinking from the Rosicrucians, for example, Theosophists and so on. But I've been, it was like I wanted to write this in 2012 because I had seen all these connections back then. But now I want to really dig into this and expose how this has been working and where it's heading and the religious ideas behind this. So that's a big, and that is also a project that is also combining, of course, music and my research, and with illustrations made by this artist that I've been working with, Kimmy Franson, and the soundtrack. So I've taken it one step further. Before it was a soundtrack with one track, but now it's a whole album, and each track has a chapter in the book explaining the story. Perfect synthesis for me.
It's wonderful to look forward to that. And when will that be out, do you think?
I hope it will be out late November, early December.
Well, we'll look forward to it. I really have enjoyed talking to you again. Thanks so much for taking the time. And explaining so much. I think knowledge is power here. We have to know what's happening behind the scene,
Yes.
where it's
Yeah.
come from
Mm,
and what's
mm.
coming. I think we can, as you say, these guys aren't very creative. They'll keep on doing the same things again. So once we understand how it's working, that's quite helpful for us to actually make decisions for our own lives. And
Yeah. And we
your,
can communicate this to other
yes,
people.
yes, and your work and your Substack is so important. The Forest Chronicles, and you're doing this unique work in fusing music and lyrics and ideas and a book. So looking forward to the Temple of Solomon. Thanks so much for taking the time on this warm Swedish morning. It's a cold evening here in Australia in the Snowy
Yeah.
Mountains,
Okay.
but it's been great. And I'm really grateful for you just taking the time with me, Jacob, and we'll stay in touch.
Yeah, we will. Yeah. Thank you very much for having me on. And
No, it's a pleasure. Thanks,
yeah,
Jacob.
yeah. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye bye.